The first time the thud came from the flat above, I was spooning curry into a Tupperware tub, trying not to count how many shifts I'd picked up this month. November in Manchester presses into your bones like wet sand. The window in my Ancoat studio sucked at the wind, and the canal below had that metallic sheen streetlights give to water when the sky is the color of dirty wool. Thud. I paused, spoon in mid-air. The building was a converted mill with exposed brick and beams everyone pretends to love until a draft finds your ankles and lives there. My upstairs neighbor was, according to the letting agent, a woman named Kay Whitlow. I'd never seen her. A month in, not a peek. Her letterbox stayed empty. Sometimes, at 3 a.m., there'd be footsteps, the halting sort you hear in old people who've learned how to walk softly. It set my nerves on edge. I work nights at the Royal Infirmary. Thud. Followed by a soft scrape, like furniture dragging. I nudged the light switch. The bulb hummed and steadied. It made the damp patch above the sink look like a shadow pinned to the ceiling. The scrape faded. The wind took its place. I popped the lid on the tub, grabbed my jacket, and checked the clock. 20 minutes to get to the tram. On my way out, I glanced up the stairwell. The second-floor landing was dark, the kind of dark that feels solid. The sensor light should have flicked on. It didn't. I climbed. Kay Whitlow had a brass number stuck to a black door, slightly crooked. Paint had bubbled where damp was trying to breathe out. I stood there, listening, and felt something in the air, like a held breath. The peephole was a cloudy, old-fashioned glass eye. I knocked. Silence. Then a whisper of movement behind wood. A subtle shift in the pressure of the air, like a lift arriving before it chimes. I knocked again. Hello. You all right up here? Something scraped. A chain tapping a door? Fabric on wood. It sounded close, pressed to the door, ear to ear with me. I reached for the handle. It turned a fraction, met the solid stop of the chain. Ms. Whitlow. I felt stupid using a name I'd never heard aloud. It's Ethan from downstairs. Thought I heard something. A breath. Not mine. It fogged the thin gap around the door. A tiny bloom of cold on my wrist where the draft licked skin. I snatched my hand back. The sensor light finally woke, spilling light over the landing and stealing the small bravery darkness gives. The moment broke. I stepped away as the door unlatched the fraction it had turned and eased itself back into place, as if someone had lifted their weight from it. "You okay?" I asked, more firmly. I listened until I heard my own blood. Nothing. The wind swelled. A tram hummed by outside, bearing students, cleaners, paramedics, people who can't afford taxis. I waited another beat and then made myself go. If she needed help, she'd say. People here hate being fussed over. I know I do. Besides, I was late. At the ground floor, I passed Liam from 1B wrestling his bike through the corridor. "You hear that?" I asked, and nodded up. "Hear what?" He was sweating through his hoodie. "Never mind," I said. On the street, the wet air slapped my face awake, and the mill's brick flank loomed like a pocketed cliff. Lights glowed in 3 windows, mine, Liam's, and one on the top floor, a square of yellow that blinked once and then held steady. I told myself that was normal as I jogged for the tram, and tried not to think about the cold on my wrist where someone else's breath had lived for a second. The hospital never sleeps. It just whispers differently. Porters push shadows. The wards smell metallic clean over sweat, disinfectant, the faint milk of gloves. I clocked in and took the run sheet from Dawes. "Been swimming," he said, clocking my wet hair. "Manchester air," I told him. I was on specimens and linens till 2. then on mortuary run if it came. "You all right, Eth?" he asked. I started to say yes, then heard that same scrape in my head, the chain tug, the breath on my wrist. "Neighbor," I said. "Old one upstairs. Might need a check. Call the warden." He meant the building's part-time caretaker with a ring of keys. "I will," I lied. Lifts stuttered, lights ticked, rain pressed at windows. At 1:30, I was pushing a trolley of clean gowns when the switchboard called. "Porter to A and Amp. E-Resus, please." I went, passing a cleaner standing very still, listening. "You hear that?" she asked, frowning toward the plasterboard ceiling. "What?" "Dripping." She shook her head. "Not rain. Slower." I did hear something then, a single drop that seemed to fall over and over without splashing. It followed me down a corridor and stopped. The Resus doors blasted me into white. A woman lay on the trolley, grey hair stuck to her face, clothes soaked. A medic snapping on a visor grunted, "Found in Ancoats, unresponsive." I helped shift her under the lights. Her skin was blue in patches, like she'd leaned against something freezing cold. The triage nurse peered into her ear and stiffened. "What's that?" she murmured. The medic leaned closer. "Frost," he said, and we laughed because it sounded like a joke. November is cold, but not that cold. When I stepped back, her eyes were open and looking at me, not past me. I knew that face from a blurred photo in my head. "Whitlow," I said under breath, because my body moved faster than sense. Her lips moved silently, like talking in steam. The medic snapped his fingers to get my attention. "Gowns to Bay 3. I went. When I looked back, she was already behind a curtain, swallowed by beeps and voices. I told myself I'd mis-seen. Half the city has grey hair and that look of walking through weather even indoors. At 3, I took waste bags to the loading dock. The rain had eased to the kind that hangs in the air. Over the extractor fans, I heard a thud. Human, like a body falling a short way. I stepped to the edge where the dock meets the car park. The security light didn't click on. It always should. "Hello," I called, and hated how thin it sounded. A breath misted in front of me, but it wasn't mine. The air smelled like old wool and cold brick. Somewhere a drip counted to 2 and stopped. A dark shape moved beyond the bins, not big but dense, like someone wrapped in a duvet. I took 2 steps and then stopped because the shape stopped when I did. That mimicry made every child sense in me sit up. I went back inside and told myself not to be an idiot. Exposure and exhaustion make ghosts out of normal things. A duvet, a rough sleeper, a cat. We bring the meaning. On my break, I Googled K. Whitlow Ancoats and got a planning application for a bike rack and a picture of someone's latte. I texted Liam. "You ever met 2F? He. Who's that? Me. K. Whitlow. Him. Doesn't ring a bell." Then, thought that flat was empty. I stared at the 3 dots and they died. Dawes yawned through his nose and said, "Mortuary. You on it?" I nodded. The pager on my hip hummed. Somewhere, a lift arrived with no one in it. By 7, my shift had frayed me to wire. The city was grey on grey, a photocopy of itself. I bought 2 bacon bombs by the tram and took one home for Liam. He forgets to eat after riding in rain. He texted, "Legend." Then, heard tapping last night. Pipes. The word tapped at me all the way from Piccadilly. The stairwell smelled of wet concrete and something sweeter, like old flowers that have given up. On the second floor landing the same cold lay in wait. The sensor light blinked before choosing a strength. I stood outside 2F and listened. No scrape. No breath. Just a faint regular sound inside, like a small hammer. Tap. 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 I don't know why I tried the handle. Habit. It turned the same fraction and met the chain. "Ms. Whitlow," I said, and felt ridiculous. "It's Ethan." Silence, and the tapping kept its patient clock. I put the balm on the floor and went down to the ground floor to find the caretaker. His office is really a cupboard with a kettle. The door was open. The keys hung, heavy as iron fruit. The one for 2F was missing. "Pete," I called. "Lads." Pete wheezed from the bin store, wiping his hands on a rag. "Morning, Eth. What you doin' up?" "Night shift," I said. "Do you have the key for 2F? Someone borrowed it last week. Blonde woman. Said she was lettings." He scratched his ear. "Never brought it back. Name?" He shrugged. "Didn't say. High vis and a clipboard. What you want 2F for?" "Heard something. Tapping." He nodded. "Wind gets in top corners. Makes odd noises." He poured water over a tea bag and squeezed it. "Place was empty when I checked." "You been in?" "Why would I? No complaints." He handed me a mug. "You think someone's in?" "I don't know," I said. "But the chain's on." Pete's forehead creased. "That is something." He rummaged and produced a thin strip of plastic with a hook at the end. "For chains. Bit of a bodge. Only if someone's in danger, mind." We went up together, footsteps out of sync. At the landing, he blew on his hands and slid the plastic into the gap as I turned the handle. The chain lifted, caught, lifted again, then dropped with a tinny surrender. The door opened 3 inches, then 6. The smell hit first, cold, damp, and a sweetness that coats your tongue. Thin morning and a hall lamp lit the flat. The tapping came from the bedroom. Tap, tap. A metronome set to unsettle. "Hello," Pete called. "Caretaker. Anyone here?" We stepped inside. The hall carpet squelched. Water tracked from the bedroom in 2 lines, each step a dark oval. Small, like a woman's. Half each oval was missing, as if the foot had been numb and dragged. "Leak," Pete said, voice too loud. At the bedroom door we stopped. Something was written in the damp, finger-drawn in condensation. "Wit." The rest had run. On the other side the tapping paused, like something turning to look at us. Pete rapped hard. "I'm comin' in." He tried the handle. It moved, and the door opened to a room peeled back by cold. Ice fronds veined the inside of the window. The radiator was off. A stool sat under the loft hatch. The tapping came from above. Pete pointed up. "Probably pigeons," he said, not believing it. We stared at the hatch, a square of darkness the size of a mouth. Tap, tap, tap. Pete fetched the pole from the cupboard and extended it, eyes on the square. The metal end clicked against the hatch once, twice, as if knocking for permission that would never be given. The tapping answered, 3 slow beats, and then the whole ceiling seemed to hold its breath with us before the sound resumed, steadier than any human hand. Pete prodded the hatch. Paint dust fell. Cold air rolled down, smelling of stored dust. He pushed the square aside and peered in. The tapping stopped like a cut wire. "What can you see?" I asked. "A torch," he said, and clicked one on. The beam found a nest between joists, blankets, 2 hot water bottles, a kettle on an extension reel, tins, protein shakes. Beside it, A cheap smartphone lay screen up, a metronome app pulsing to 60 beats a minute. Tap, tap, tap. Taped to a beam in cling film, a hospital wristband, K. Whitlow, dated last week. Squatter, Pete muttered. I lifted the phone. On the screen sat an unsent draft. I am up. The cover was smeared by clumsy, cold fingers. Near the party wall, a scorch mark ringed a camping stove. A pan had dried white with milk. She could have burned us all, Pete said, dropping back to the bedroom. He killed the water to stop the wet tracks. In the pause the city made between showers, I felt my own heart. The lamp flickered and steadied. A draft ran over my neck. Police came. They bagged the phone and wristband, photographed the blankets and stove, and screwed the hatch shut. The letting agent arrived shivering. Nobody named Whitlow on our books, she said. Deposit bounced. I told her about the blonde who'd borrowed Pete's key. She wrote it down and didn't meet my eye. At the hospital that night Dawes held his phone so I'd have to see. Woman from last night didn't make it. A tiny headline said hypothermia. The photo was a bus camera smear. The face was hers. I pictured the unsent message and the breath that had crossed my wrist and felt, for a second, as if I was the one who had failed to arrive. Days tidied the mess. New locks, a new sensor light, the hatch screwed flush. Rational work poured around a hole and set. Lifts still arrived empty, so I took the stairs. On the second floor landing the new light behaved itself. I put my hand on 2FS door, cool as ever. On fresh paint, 4 letters swelled from condensation. Wit. Pipes ticked somewhere. From inside came one slow tap. Then nothing. I told myself it was plumbing, that the word came from water and the memory of hands. All of it explainable. A woman chasing warmth found a dry place, borrowed a key, climbed to where heat pools at ceilings. The breath through a peephole, the wet steps, the metronome, props in the same harsh story. At my door I fished for keys and found an extra disc, a brass key on a cheap fob stamped 2F. Pete must have slipped it to me, I thought, or I'd pocketed it without noticing. Keys get lost and go on living. I set it on the counter. At 3, above me, footsteps moved in a careful pattern, the kind you learn when you're trying not to wake anyone. I lay still and tracked them room to room. At 4, my phone lit with a text from an unknown number. No message, just a blank bubble, then nothing. I got up, made tea, waiting for the sky to go from slate to gauze. On my way out I dropped the key in Pete's drawer. Found this, I said. He squinted. Not ours, he said. That cut doesn't match our cylinders. He tossed it back into the tangle of unclaimed things. Outside, the canal wore its metal skin again. High in the mill, a square of yellow blinked once, then held steady. The day would name things. The night would take the names back. I stepped toward the tram when the glass of the shelter fogged near my wrist, a faint bloom that grew and faded without anyone close enough to breathe. The tram arrived. Its doors opened on warm air, and for a heartbeat I imagined cold fingers slipping quickly into the gap to ride where the heat goes.